Hello, and welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we explore the intersections of horror film and feminism. This is Anna, co-founder of the Final Girls and your podcast host. For the next few months, we are tracing the lineage of female monsters in horror cinema, and in each episode, I am joined by a special guest to dive deep into a monster movie or two. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about one of the strange films that live in this gray zone between art house and horror cinema. It was also the first film that the Final Girls ever screened way back in May 2016. And to be honest, probably the reason why a lot of our friends gave us some very strange looks when they left the cinema. It's also one of the only, if not the only film that's allowed to get away with using Comic Sans in its opening title credits. I'm talking about Trouble Every Day, the erotic cannibal horror by French auteur Claire Denis. The film follows American newlyweds Shane and June Brown as they honeymoon in Paris. But once there, Shane begins a search for his former colleague Leo, who might have a cure for a mysterious affliction that has transformed both Shane and Leo's wife Corey into greedy sexual cannibals. I've been a big fan of this film for many years now, and I'm excited to be joined by the super smart writer Layla Latif to unpack some of the questions raised in Trouble Every Day and offer also a fascinating, completely new read on the film. As always, our conversation will contain spoilers. From about halfway through our chat, we'll be talking about the film's ending and some key scenes. I'll put the exact moment in the show notes. I really do encourage everyone to seek this film out. It's a true outlier. It used to be quite difficult to find, but it is now available to stream in the UK on Mubi. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Just maybe don't watch it on the first date. Layla, welcome back to the podcast. How are you?
Yeah, really good to be back. It's been an end to a not the best summer ever, but we're all still soldiering in.
That we are, and thankfully we've got a myriad of old horror films to get us through it.
Yeah.
And today we're going to be talking about one of my, not to set the bar very high, but this is probably one of my favorite films and one that I haven't been able to stop thinking about about 10 years since I first saw it.
Interesting.
Yes. So I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on it. So we're going to be chatting about Trouble Every Day, the horror love story by filmmaker Claire Denis.
To Mr. and Mrs. Brown.
Welcome to Paris, Mrs. Brown. I hope you'll enjoy your stay.
No, Dr. Semino doesn't work here anymore.
Look into my eyes.
I really need to find him.
You see trouble every day.
Just up and left.
His wife is sick.
Sun inside.
Corey's sick?
He is very sick.
Get on inside you. You can blow such your slightest breath. And I know
You were in love with her? It's not the right word for it.
and this trip this trip
Do you believe in loyalty, Mr. Brown? What about betrayal? I would never hurt you.
So let's kick it off. What is your relationship with this film and with the films of Claire Denis?
Well, I think I have to start by admitting that I have like a really terrible bias when it comes to this film because, and I don't say this lightly, I hate Vincent Gallo so much. Like, I hate everything about him. I think he's a terrible actor. I think he's an awful human being. I am one of the people that foolishly sat through Brown Bunny, which is one of the most unenjoyable things you can do as a human. So I kind of started on the back foot with this film, and like his mere presence on screen like slightly enraged me. So I don't know how much that has informed my opinion. But I love Claire Denis. I haven't seen everything that she's done, but I love the film Chocolat, and I loved High Life recently. So I was trying to kind of park my biases at the door. Yeah, but, you know, I have to confess, there was a rage that bubbled in me every time I saw his awful face on screen.
I mean, listen, I get it. I get the same feeling every time I see Adam Levine on screen, which he keeps insisting on doing. But you're not wrong. Vincent Gallo is an extremely hateable human being.
Yeah, he's bad at his job, and he's bad at being a human being just out there in the world. For people that don't know, you can buy Vincent Gallo's sperm for $1 million. Or for $50,000, he will have sex with you. And he stipulates even if you have red hair, are black or fat. So, you know, he sucks.
He's gone beyond the red flag, and he's just, you know, parking the I am trash flag in just like right in front of his house and online everywhere.
But I think most of what people know him from is he had that feud with the late great Roger Ebert about Brown Bunny.
Well, he had many feuds.
Yeah,
he had many feuds. Yeah, but
putting that aside, trying to
parking the trash heap that is Vincent Gallo to one side. What did you make of Trouble Every Day?
I thought it was very interesting. I think one of my things that I struggled with is I kept trying to kind of click into, like, what is this about? Is this all like a metaphor about the AIDS crisis? Is this all about kind of, you know, sexual politics? Is this about kind of like the evils of like, you know, is like sexual freedom? And then nothing worked by the time we got to the end of the final sexual assault. So I was kind of left feeling a little bit empty whilst the actual process of it was very captivating. So yeah, I'm hoping to figure out with you what I actually feel about this film, because I'm not settled on one position.
Interesting. And was this the first time that you watched it?
Yeah, it was the first time that I watched it, but watching it, I was very familiar with a lot of the images from this film. Like, I think there's a lot of Beatrice, is it Beatrice Dalle? That image of her.
Beatrice Dalle, yeah.
Yeah, with her kind of beautiful full lips and covered in blood. And there's a particular moment in the film where she's sort of pacing in front of this bloodied wall. Like, I was familiar with those. So, yeah, I think the Vincent Gallo thing had stopped me from hitting play. But I mean, I'm certainly glad I watched it.
It's interesting that you mentioned kind of trying to figure out what the film is about, because it's one of the things that I also keep thinking every time I've seen it. I've probably seen it maybe over 10 times over the years. And when I rewatched it just this morning prior to our conversation, it again seemed like an entirely different film. So every time I've seen it, I'm like, oh, now I get it. This is it. And then every time I come back to it, it's like, oh no, I was wrong. Yeah. It's actually this whole other thing. And there's so many different ways of experiencing it. And within Claire Denis's film, it's also a very strange piece of work, because at least when it came out, it was not very well received at all by the critical community. And it seemed weird that someone who was very much established in the art house world would do essentially quite a slow-paced body horror. So, and the images that you bring up that you were familiar with are very, very gory and bloody. The images of Corey kind of all covered in blood.
Yeah.
So what do you think about, if we try to think about Trouble Every Day as a body horror film, what do you think of those bloody or horrific elements of it?
I think it's interesting because the way that she kind of shoots so much of the violence and the sex in such close up, that like even before we've gotten to a single drop of blood, a lot of things feel very grotesque. Even like there's a scene at the beginning which kind of doesn't really tie to anything, but just a couple kissing in like real close up, and like there's, I don't know how she does it, but it both feels disgusting and like quite like you feel a little nervous watching it, like that these two people are kind of in like slightly vulnerable positions and like, you know, something nasty could happen at every second. Yeah, so it's an unusual type of body horror because we don't see much beyond just kind of blood. And then we see things in like close up. So yeah, it's not Cronenberg for sure. But it's very, very effective, and it's very, I mean, I think it's a very upsetting is like a lot of the horror in this film. Like it doesn't just, you can't just kind of play it off as like fun or silly. Like it's gory, it kind of gets under your skin and it haunts you a little bit. A lot of those images, especially at the end.
Yes, the images and also some of the, it always seemed to me a little bit sort of that there's a distance between the music, the sound, and the images, because there's Tinderstick's soundtrack is so melancholic and it's so sweet almost, that then when it's put on top of really, really graphic, bloody images, it sort of distances or almost makes the effect of the gore a little bit more intense for me. I don't know if how the soundtrack played into your experience of the film.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I didn't think of it in those terms. But yeah, there is like a strange juxtaposition of those two elements. And I'm not really sure what that's for. But it is very, because that normally if you did something like that, it's because you would be trying to kind of create a little bit of levity in that scene. And this doesn't do that at all. It kind of does the exact opposite. But I guess that's kind of the mastery of Claire Denis, that she can, you know, do surprising things to the opposite effect that you would expect.
And there is sort of a real almost sweetness to the way that she films some of the graphic scenes, and I'm thinking especially of the ones that kind of dissolve into someone being eaten by someone else. I wanted to kind of hear your thoughts, what you made of those scenes in particular, because they switch so, not even quickly, they switch so smoothly between a scene that you can imagine being a sex scene or a scene that you can imagine being a sex scene that's being presented as such, and suddenly there's screams and there's blood and there's an assault going on, or someone is literally being eaten alive. So what did you make about the particular way that Denis films those scenes?
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of the masterstroke reveal of the film, because, I mean, right from the beginning, we see kind of that this is what happens with the trucker that she encounters, that like that this is someone who kind of has a sexual encounter with someone, and then we see like this grotesque corpse that her husband has to help her dispose of. And so we know that it's coming, but I think the way that she kind of shoots it in such close up, and because you know that this is inevitable, you're right, that transition is really smooth. And you know, I think that's maybe some parallel that she's trying to kind of draw about sex and sexual intimacy, and like, you know, that's where I thought that like, is this kind of cannibalism, vampiric side of this woman supposed to be literally just an extension of her sexual desire rather than anything switching at all?
That's one of the really interesting, I think, questions around the film. And especially because when we first start, Corey is like at the sort of on a highway, essentially picking up anyone that she can find for an encounter. And it's, even the images are very much kind of, we can read it pretty plainly that she's there to pick up a man. And then there's this transition into, well, she's eaten him or she's drained him in some way. So how do you think the film plays around with the idea of hunger and desire as almost interchangeable.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because that's almost the bit that I kind of couldn't quite figure out. I'd be interested to know what you think. But like, because at times it does feel like it's like this vulnerable person, and it's a disease that they have that makes this out of their control. And then at other points, it seems like this is just an extension of their sexual desire. And then at other points, it's so linked to infidelity within this film that I'm like, is that what we're trying to say? You know, so I left very unclear on that. But then I suppose the film purposefully gives you a lot of room to kind of make up your mind about things, like narrative wise. I mean, the entire film, in a way, in most films would just be a setup, whilst, you know, she gives us very little in terms of explanation, what the rules are of this, really what people's dynamics were, that they previously knew one another, and how it all works. So, yeah, I think you could come away from it really interpreting this film very differently, which I suppose is what you were saying earlier, that you've seen it 10 times and it seems very different to you each time. I think some of that might also be Vincent Gallo's bad acting. Maybe he was trying to give us a bit more. He's definitely the worst thing in it, though. I mean, when you think how hypnotic some of the other, especially the women in this film, are, he seems like he's very stiff comparatively. Whilst, you know, when you just think of Beatrice Dalle's like beautiful, just like her little movements, like is this kind of broken ballerina, and this like does she have any dialogue? I mean, she might not. But how much she gives you with that, with just like these slight movements and these like little gestures and looks that she gives to people, whilst comparatively, like Vincent Gallo gives us, you know, nowhere near as much. Perhaps with a more compelling central performance, I would have understood how I felt about the film.
It's interesting because you bring up several really, really interesting points. Yes, I agree. Vincent Gallo is super stiff. I almost think it's deliberate because he is an American in Paris and he has a way of carrying himself that is extremely different, and his acting style, whether you want to think about it as an acting style or just him being a bad actor, is very, very different from everyone else around him. And the other thing that you pointed out that is very interesting is the fact that Beatrice Dalle has this thing, and I swear I didn't notice until maybe last year when the film was screening at the BFI and I had to introduce it. And I rewatched the film again for it, and it genuinely was the first time I realized that Corey has no dialogue. Yeah. Because every time I'd watched it in my head, she was speaking. Because, you know, there's a lot of close-ups on her mouth. And Beatrice Dalle has such an incredible face as well.
She really does.
In my mind, she was screaming. She was making noise. She was speaking, especially with her husband, Leo. Yeah. But actually, she doesn't. It's all based on what this very, very silent performance is giving you. Like, you almost remember her speaking even though the character isn't, which I find really interesting, kind of as an after effect of the film, like an aftershock almost. Yeah. But there's a thing I wanted to get your thoughts on, which is kind of how do you think, you mentioned infidelity and perhaps kind of as how these two couples that we meet who are dealing essentially with the same affliction, you know, cannibalism or vampirism, or, you know, this kind of element of monstrosity that's very related to sex. How do you think these two couples, so there's Shane and his new wife and they're supposed to be on a honeymoon, and there's Corey and Leo, what do you make of the way that they both deal with this situation where one of the parties is afflicted with this disease and the other one isn't?
Yeah, well, I suppose the difference is that with Corey and Leo is that he knows. I mean, does June ever know? I
don't think she knows,
because she seems very upset
because it's not explicit.
Yeah.
I think she's upset by the sexual nature of it, by the fact that there is always like this barrier between them.
Mm-hmm.
And she can tell that Shane isn't really there or is holding himself back, but he's never really explicitly been violent to her or in front of her.
No. But we start one of the first, I mean, they're very sweet and affectionate with one another, her and Shane, but he is from minute one having like violent fantasies about her.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that in both dynamics, you have these kind of people that have this, in Shane and in Corey, that they have this vampiric curse, however you'd want to interpret it. I mean, there's suggestion that it's sort of part of some biological warfare, but it's unclear. But in both cases, it does not manifest when with their spouse. But it does seem that when it comes to Corey and Leo's relationship, that's still a satisfying sexual dynamic. Whilst when it comes to Shane and June, he clearly is like quite unsatisfied by this. He's, obsessed with other women, and he is masturbating in the bathroom rather than having sex with his wife. So, I mean, I wondered afterwards whether that was just her commenting on like the nature of infidelity when it came to men and women, like with men, that it sort of is a barrier in their relationship with their spouse, whilst kind of women, it can kind of be part of more of a kind of a sexual freedom. Next time I'm watching it, I'm sure I'll think something completely different.
Which is both the infuriating and the great thing about any film by Claire Denis, is that it asks more questions than it gives you answers, I think.
Yeah, which is admirable, really. Like, we don't need to be spoon-fed everything. We can engage with the cinema we watch and, have to think about it and pass it out in our minds. And
I'd love to zero in a little bit on Corey, because she's, I think, one of the most interesting characters in this film. And definitely kind of more of an art house monster in a way. So we talked a little bit about Béatrice Dalle, but what do you think of her performance and of Corey as a character?
I think she's by far the strongest thing in this film, and I really cannot imagine this film working at all without her. She's just hypnotic. She's so subtle at times, and so within those kind of sexual scenes, like, she just kind of seems to be able to access this like really primal thing without ever going too big with it. I think it's something that's actually incredibly difficult to do, because also this monster, this affliction, whatever it is not something that there's a huge amount of reference for. Like, she has to kind of create something that's, in of itself, which you can imagine a lot of people doing very badly. But no, she's incredible. But I mean, part of it actually just comes down to really just what an astonishing face she has. Like, you kind of want to just paint a portrait of it. So I can understand why the images from this film, particularly of her, have really like stayed with people.
Yeah, she does. I think Béatrice Dalle has like one of my favorite faces off the screen ever. But there's something really interesting that I was thinking about these iconic images. Maybe iconic is slightly a strong word, because this film is not as widely known and it's not as widely distributed. It's not like super available on it's not on Blu-ray, it's out of print on DVD.
Really?
Yeah.
Actually, no, that's right. I had to email you being like, where can I find this?
Yeah, I mean, this is of interest maybe to literally 2 people and the other one being Olivia. But it was this was the film that we first screened as The Final Girls, and like it hadn't been screened in London in about a decade.
Wow.
When we screened it. But I digress. Kind of one of those images that's always stayed with me, and that you reference a bit as well, is those images of Corey covered in blood. And there's something interesting about the idea of this character, of this woman sort of playing in the blood.
Yeah.
Like she's literally covered in it, and then she's sort of rubbing it on herself, and she's wearing this sort of white dress that's entirely covered with her victim's blood, and she's sort of walking around and playing around in it almost in a childlike manner. And there's something a little subversive about that, because we're so very used to images of women in horror films of women covered in blood, but very often they're victims and they're not sort of reveling in their gore. So I wanted to see kind of, what do you think of the image of Corey kind of within the context of horror?
Well, I mean, part of that just comes down to this phenomenal performance that she manages to kind of, it seems to be both empowering for her, but she keeps this vulnerability at all times. And I think she really does seem to be a little deflated after her sexual encounters, and like not entirely kind of, you know, like joyful with the kind of having won the hunt and like devoured her prey. Like it's more complicated than that. I think in a way it is kind of that metaphor for sex, because it was just like, oh, you've kind of climaxed, and then it's like, oh, you know, okay, like it's fine. Was that all worth it in the end? Which I think ties into like these ideas of infidelity, because like sometimes you do have this like insane desire for someone, and it's like, oh, okay, I went with that, but like no, I've kind of ruined my life. So that's maybe there's just so many different ways to look at her. It's a really interesting film, but like her performance without that, I just can't imagine it. Like I actually think once she's gone, I really lost interest a bit. Like, but again, that is my Vincent Gallo bias probably coming out.
And what did you think, kind of, you know, picking up on this tension that you reference? There's quite a chunk in the middle of the film where Corey is essentially locked in the attic of her house by her husband. Yeah. Ostensibly for her own and other people's protection. There's a lot of scenes of these two local boys sort of trying to get in the house and then literally ripping the door apart to get at her. Yeah. What did you make of... Yeah.
I thought it was like a kind of cool reinterpretation of the Rapunzel story.
Amazing. Go on.
Well, yeah, it is kind of like, it's almost like they're like desperately in love with her, and they're kind of climbing this tower to like finally partly free her, but to have her. And of course that goes like horribly, well, depends whose perspective you look at it, but it kind of goes horribly wrong. Yeah, I thought it was really cool how they kept that interesting, because we sort of know what's going to happen. But even those like little performances by those young male actors kind of kept shifting how you felt about the whole thing. Because in a way, in a lesser film, it would be like they would be kind of much more rapey and a little bit getting what they deserved. But the film's kind of stops short of that, where they are overstepping their boundaries and they are being, well, gross. But like you really do feel fearful that for them, and like empathize with them when it goes as badly wrong as it does. And that as a death scene is the second death, the big scene at the end is in many respects more horrifying, but that scene, because we don't really know how this is going to work, makes all of the sex kind of building up to it so much more frightening. Yeah, I thought it was really, really effective.
You just made me really remember that first screening that we did, and sitting surrounded by about 100 people. And when that scene came on and Corey started eating the boy's face, you could sense that the whole room was sort of like kind of into it, and then kind of a little bit horned up. And then suddenly she started eating the face, and it's like, oh no, no, this is not, I was not expecting that.
I'm amazed anyone was horned up. I've never felt like I was like ready to run to a nunnery by like the end of the second act.
And what did you make of this kind of, you bring up Rapunzel, but what do you make of this image of the way that the film kind of plays around with the image of the I'm using air quotes here, which I do every time, and I know it's terrible podcast content, and I cannot stop doing it, of, you know, the woman in the attic, the woman that's kind of locked in supposedly for her own good.
Oh, yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't think of it in those terms. I kind of, well, my assumption is because, like, her dynamic with Leo seems to be a very, like, affectionate one and kind of weirdly non-judgmental, is that this is an arrangement they have somewhat agreed to, in that, like, you know, I can't contain myself, so you have to, like, help me not get into trouble. But maybe that's just me reading far too much into their sexual chemistry. It's certainly interesting. I mean, it does seem to be like a very loving dynamic. Whilst you have Vincent Gallo, and he at one point says like, oh, he never loved her, but he was very attracted to her. There's like that contrast with Leo, who like seems to have like a very like loving affection for her that isn't, well, from my interpretation, necessarily about control. Like, he sincerely wants to like help her.
Yeah.
So my feeling with all of those you know, gates and security and stuff was was more about not letting people get in rather than letting her get out.
Yeah. No, that's there's so many ways into that relationship. And I wanted to zero in a little bit on the relationship between Shane and Corey. So we're kind of following their stories separately, and then they finally meet. What did you make of the way that they interact and that the ending of Corey, essentially?
I thought that was one scene that was outright bad. That whole the effects with the fire is like very naff, the way it's done, and it's sort of it really took me out of it, to be honest. And then also you have this moment where like Leo comes back and I sort of wanted something more, but it really cuts away like far too quickly to go back to a lot of close-ups of Vincent Gallo. So, you know, you can imagine how I felt about that. But I'm interested. Do you assume, with all of the kind of science that's supposed to be happening in the background, that whatever has infected Corey, Shane already had, or do you think he gets it in that scene?
No, I think you definitely had it already.
Okay.
That was one thing that I thought was quite explicit in the film, that he is essentially going to Paris, not because he wants a honeymoon in Paris, but because he wants to go to the scientists that develop that whatever. Like, it's like you said, it's not the backstory of the serum or the disease is not overly explained. It's not really explained whether they are genetically just manifested this affliction or whether it was somehow artificial, because Leo is a scientist and Shane is a scientist, and, you know, we're told that they had some sort of, you know, they were colleagues and that's how they sort of knew each other. But I think they both had it, and now perhaps it's reaching the point where it's uncontrollable, and they're experiencing it differently. And I think it's sort of, what I'm thinking out loud here, one of the interesting potential readings of it might be that Corey's affliction is more advanced because she cannot control herself, whether Shane still can throughout the majority of the film, and she can't speak. And I wonder if that's kind of like a deliberate thing where she's lost the ability to communicate outside of sort of gasps and screams in a really visceral, primal way. Whether Shane is still coherent, even if, you know, not a very nice man by any stretch of the imagination. But that meeting between them I found interesting, because it's like, is it where they're just kind of trying to get at each other because they're essentially sharing the same thing, sharing the same affliction? But the decision to have Shane kill Corey, I found the more I've seen it, and the older I've gotten since I've been rewatching it, the more I read into it, kind of the more not problematic but an interesting take on Shane's own relationship with women that it shows. The way that he treats his wife, the way that he treats the maid, and
Oy.
we're definitely going to ask you about that scene. And that encounter with Corey, it's not, I remember reading it first kind of as an encounter of recognition, but whenever I watch it now, I'm like, oh no, she was sort of already, I think, priming herself up to die. Like, she's playing around with the matches. It's pretty much foretold that she's going to set the house on fire and she's going to kill herself. But Shane takes that decision away from her.
Yeah. My assumption is that she's doing that for Leo because she just doesn't want him to continue in this cycle of like having to bury bodies the entire time. But yeah, it's a shame that was taken away from her. I don't want this to become like one of those like YouTube videos that's like trouble every day ending explained. But my assumption.
No, I love it. Go for it.
My assumption.
that is the art house ending explained YouTube channel that I want in my head, that I want to see. Please go ahead.
My assumption is that Shane had an encounter very much like the kind of neighborhood Rapunzel boys with Corey years before, but he escaped and he has since been completely obsessed with her and as a result wants to track her down, and in the second encounter becomes infected with this thing, which was kind of his intention the whole time because he was so attracted to her and became like obsessed with this kind of bloodlust that she had, which is why it manifests differently. That was, but then I could be very wrong, but when they had those moments about like I was attracted to her rather than loved her, and then that's kind of cutting to the young guys who are like desperate to get to this woman, I just assumed that's what they were referring to happened to him.
Goosebumps. Actual goosebumps. I love that reading.
You should hear me talk about Tenet. Like I got some thoughts.
Oh my god, I love it. I'd never thought of it like that. That's fantastic. Okay. Now I've totally lost my train of thought because I want to rewatch it now again. I've been watching a lot of these female monster films for the series. And one thing that kind of keeps one of the recurring things is that the monster always dies. Usually is killed by someone. So what do you think of the decision of Corey having to die?
I think it's a shame, and it's kind of a cop-out. I mean, the dynamic between her and her husband is quite like the one that you have in like Let the Right One In. And I really preferred that ending of like, just like that this is going to kind of continue on in one way or another. And having it end in, again, like I really didn't like that fire scene. And then not seeing, and I know it's not a film that like gives you everything, but I still felt that we could have just seen a little bit more, or, have her perhaps attempt to kill herself. And then you could have this moment of like Leo trying to decide whether or not he wanted to continue in this kind of toxic dynamic and save her or let her die and like live his life. And I think it's a shame that that's kind of not the way that it went, because I wasn't as interested in what was going on with Shane and June. And I just feel so bad for that maid. Like, what you got, Christelle?
Well, I was going to ask you about that. After Corey's death and after the house goes up in flames, the film still continues, and we're pretty much with Shane and June and Christelle, the maid now. So what do you think about that scene when he finally succumbs to his hunger?
I think this is probably the moment where I'm like, I don't know how to feel about this film, because that was possibly the most horrible scene of sexual assault I've ever seen. Like, I can't really think anything that really comes close. Yeah, I kind of don't know how to feel about it, because it almost feels like it's beyond artistry at some point. And if I can't fully understand what this is trying to say, I don't know how I can kind of almost excuse it. Do you know what I mean? It's tough to watch. It really is. And there's a power to how tough it is to watch. But I think when you have sort of that dynamic playing out with like a kind of female vampiric thing and a man we're sort of switching the power dynamic, and we're kind of trying to say something with it. But when you see a woman, especially essentially, it's almost like a date rape scenario, in that she is very attracted to him, and then she wants to stop, and what happens. We're seeing something that is a very like real threat to women play out. So I'm not saying that the film is like artistically bankrupt, but I didn't know what we were seeing meant much more than just being like unpleasant and kind of shock worthy. Yeah. It's tough, and I think in a way I kind of need to almost process it a little bit more, because I mean I had to kind of rewind a couple of times, because the first times I was like, yeah, volume off, can't quite do this, and then like okay, now I know that it's coming, I can come back to it with the volume on. Yeah, I mean, I would say if sexual violence is something that triggers you at all, keep a very wide berth of this film.
It's an incredibly valid point to question the choice of that scene, and I think that's one of the power of that scene for me, is the fact that it very brutally illustrates that consent is malleable, and that what you consent to in one moment doesn't necessarily allow for something entirely different. So that scene begins as quite a consent, like a consensual sexual encounter between them. Like it's illicit, but and
it's been established that she's attracted to him. There is
there's been quite a lot of build up throughout the film, but then it shifts into a violent aggression, and it's heightened in a way because there's this affliction, and they're cannibals or vampires, however you want to interpret it, but it's essentially a very graphic illustration of the rough sex defense. It's like nobody can consent to being murdered, or nobody can consent to being assaulted, and that scene kind of zeroes in on her face in a way that is incredibly assaulting in many ways. But also I find it extremely powerful. And one of the things, it might be too much for some people, especially this fits into New French Extremity as a sort of loose movement of films that were really trafficking with explicit and extreme sexual and physical violence as a way to comment on bigger and political issues. But it is it's a terrifying ending, because Shane at this point has now murdered 2 women, and he goes back to his wife, and he showers off and continues on his honeymoon.
So we are in a way kind of, maybe like the core of this film is just like a commentary on infidelity, but it seems then like a little unjustifiable to sort of use such a graphic sexual assault to just kind of explain like a man's journey with his like infidelity. Like it just left me feeling a little like grubby. No,
I can see that. And it's the aftertaste of this film is interesting because it's interesting that you've sort of explained it, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you felt about the film kind of after it finished.
First time after it finished, I was just kind of quite blown away. I think there was kind of a lot of adrenaline. Like it was like a very tough final scene, but like, I really, the film doesn't necessarily follow like a path that you're going to expect it to. So, and then the second time I watched it, I was like, ooh, you know what I mean? Just felt a little bit like, is this a justifiable use of graphic sexual assault on screen? Like we're almost kind of getting into Girlfriend in the Fridge scenario, where it's just like, oh, we're going to use like a graphic sexual assault of a woman to show you this kind of inner workings of like what's going on with this man, which I mean, perhaps there's a hypocrisy that I didn't have any real issue with it when the tables were turned. But then, it's not really the same thing. A woman murdering a man murdering a woman. And, and also there is kind of an element of like that there is something slightly magical, something happening with Corey that like makes her able to do this. Whilst him in that scene, like it's nothing beyond the regular strength of that dynamic. So yeah, I just thought it on a repeat viewing, it left me quite uncomfortable. But I'd rather be uncomfortable and challenged by a film than not. So those things are not necessarily like a tick against the film for me.
No, it's a really interesting, and I ask that question because the aftertaste of the film, I find with this, and there's very few films I find like that, especially the ones that sort of live in this weird gray region of art house and horror where they're too horrific for your regular art house crowd and they're a bit too slow moving or arty for your regular horror crowd. Yeah. So I love that kind of gray area, but it's not for everyone. And this film is one of the very few that I found that people feel very differently from person to person. You literally remember different things stick to you because, and maybe it's the thing that you were talking about at the beginning when we started recording of what is it about? And there's so much space for you to project or take away or attach yourself to different elements that I always remembered Corey. I always remembered Béatrice Dalle. I remember I didn't watch it for quite a few years and I was like, oh wait, oh right, Vincent Gallo was in this. I'd completely erased him from the film
and is the protagonist. I mean, it's funny that like even like now thinking about it, it's so Beatrice's film. And
I always thought of her as the protagonist. Yeah,
she should be. I mean, not that I'm going to tell Claire Denis how to make films, but she should be.
She is in my book, but yeah, I find it very fascinating kind of how it attaches yourself to you as a viewer and the things that remain after it's done. Because I always almost think of it as ending after the fire scene. And I'm always surprised, even though I've seen it so many times, I'm always surprised that there is still a bit of film left.
Yeah.
And that it
is quite weird. I mean, aside from like the sexual assault, there is a lot of kind of strangeness in that last 20 minutes, like with him with the puppy, and then he gets like, he's kind of then very inappropriate with that a middle-aged woman on a train. And that's actually the time in the film where we really understand his dynamic with June the best in many ways. And I still didn't take that much from it compared to just like Béatrice Dalle walking down the stairs. Like, she is just, I mean, the film is so much more interesting when it focuses on her, which I've said repeatedly, but really it's kind of can't be overstated how good she is. And also how much I hate Vincent Gallo. I will give him no credit.
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. You're absolutely not wrong. It's certainly a very strange film, and we've spoken about it for almost an hour, and we're nowhere near close to even understanding all of the layers of it, which I kind of love about it. But would you recommend?
Is it an AIDS metaphor?
Seek it out?
Maybe. Yes, definitely. Undoubtedly, you've got to seek it out. Find it on Mubi. That's where I got to watch it. It's definitely worth seeking out, and it's worth watching more than once.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Layla. And where can people find out more about your work?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Layla Latif, or you can pick up the next editions of Little White Lies or Sight and Sound, and I appear a few times in both. This is the best time of year for me. Autumn. Got all the horror films.
Oh, you can also read Layla's amazing coverage of Fantasia Film Festival over in Bloody Women as well. very savage and very funny.
Yeah, thanks so much for thinking of me for that. I had so much fun with so many of those films. I think that's one of the great things about genre cinema, that even the bad stuff is bad in an interesting way.
Yes, exactly. And that's it for this episode of the Final Girls podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere you get your shows. If you can, please do leave us a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts. It helps a lot with finding new listeners. And you can find out more about what we do, including screening erotic cannibal horror films to unsuspecting members of the public, over on thefinalghost.co.uk. And you can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Final Ghost UK. You can follow Layla on Twitter at Layla Latif, and I tweet emoji-based horror humor over on Anna Be Demented. Thank you for listening, and next week we're going to be covering vagina dentatas, in our deep dive into teeth.